This morning, we are closing our Easter message series, Possible. Our goal for this series is that we want you to have a renewed sense of hope and confidence in the resurrection. And that comes from a relationship with the risen Jesus who is very present in your life. This morning, we are going to look at the 10th chapter of John's Gospel. Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees and other religious leaders. And in his speech, he uses the imagery that would have been very familiar to them, that of a shepherd. He also describes a scene that they would have been aware of. Here's what he says. Amen, amen, I say to you. Whoever does not enter a sheepfold through the gate, but climbs over elsewhere, is a thief and a robber. So Jesus says that a robber or a thief does not enter the sheepfold through the gate, but climbs over the wall to steal the sheep. He continues, but whoever enters through the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens it for him, and the sheep hear his voice, as the shepherd calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. The shepherd would have a special call for the sheep. They heard that voice every single day, so they became accustomed to that voice. So when they heard the call of the shepherd, they would follow him. The shepherd would then lead them out of the pen, and he would lead them into the fields. There are certain voices, as we know, that we recognize, and they bring us comfort and security. As a kid, you recognize the voice of your parents. Maybe you recall a time as a child when you were separated from your parents, perhaps at the supermarket or at the mall. You were scared and you were alone, and then you heard the voice of your parents and you knew that everything would be okay. Now you are older, and perhaps it might be the voice of your spouse or a good friend. When you hear their voice or their greeting, you perk up, and it brings joy to your heart. In the same way, hearing your name also gets your attention. The sweetest sound to anyone is the sound of their own name. We especially love hearing our name said in a place where we feel all alone, or perhaps we're on our own. There's a joy in knowing someone knows you and is glad that you are there. Jesus says that he knows the name of his sheep. He calls his sheep his people, his followers by name, and he knows them well. He continues the analogy. When he has driven out all his own, he walks ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they recognize his voice. The shepherd would lead them out of the pen and provide direction, protection, and provision. Notice what Jesus says about the shepherd. The shepherd walks ahead of the sheep. He leads them to places of provision. The shepherd goes ahead of the sheep and scouts out the problems. The problem might be an attack from wild animals. The problem might be a wrong turn that would have led the sheep falling off a cliff. The shepherd goes before, so he knows what is coming. Do you know that Jesus has already been to your future? He walks ahead of you. Your future is no surprise to him. He knows the wrong turns and the cliffs that you need to avoid. He sees the things that are going to attack your heart and your mind. He knows the events that are going to fill us with fear and concern or worry. He knows the pitfalls and the problems, but he also knows the places of provision. He knows the places where you can find provision for your heart, for your soul, for your mind, for your body. And he walks ahead of you and wants to lead you to the place of provision. Jesus continues the analogy. But they will not follow a stranger. They will run away from him because they do not recognize the voice of strangers. Sheep are not very smart animals. Sheep are simple animals. But here is something that they always seem to get right. They are smart enough to not follow the voice of the stranger. People often or generally follow the voices that are familiar to them. You follow the voice you recognize, sometimes whether it can be helpful to you or not. Have you ever walked in on a friend or family member or perhaps a teenager listening to someone, a YouTuber or a radio talk host show or on a news station, and immediately grated on you? That voice grated on you? Instantly you were annoyed, and maybe you even became concerned about who that they were listening to. And you even thought that the voice was leading your friend or family member perhaps to a bad place. You could see so clearly that they were leading the person into fear or bitterness or anger, things that were not good. Have you ever thought about that for yourself? Are there some voices that you listen to because they are familiar to you? But if you step back and you evaluated them, you admit that they were not filling you with hope and confidence in the future, but rather with fear and anxiety and worry for the future. Jesus says his sheep listen to his voice, and they don't follow another. He continues. Jesus says, a thief comes only to steal and slaughter and destroy. I came so that they might have life and have it more abundantly. Jesus contrasts himself with a thief. There are thieves out there looking to steal your joy and peace of mind. There are thieves of worry and anger and fear and anxiety, distrust and discord. They kill and destroy your future and your relationships. When you listen to those voices, they rob you of life. Jesus said he came that you may have life and have it more abundantly. As you listen to the voice of Jesus, he leads you to abundant peace, abundant joy, abundant confidence in the future. So here's the one hope we should have during this time and all times. We ought to grow in our intimacy with the Lord so that we can hear the voice of our shepherd. If we learn to better hear and discern the voice of Jesus, the Good Shepherd, he will lead us to a place of provision. If we learn to hear his voice, we know we have a future full of hope because he is the Good Shepherd who has already laid down his life for us. He is the Good Shepherd who goes before us. Jesus has the words of eternal and abundant life. His words bring life. This does not mean his words are always easy to hear, but there are 3 steps, I think, that you and I can take to learn to hear Jesus' voice. These steps are simple, but they are not something you do once and that's it. They are not set it and forget it. We come back to them over and over again. The first is to ask Jesus to let you hear his voice. We have to want to hear the voice of Jesus enough that we ask him to speak to us. And Jesus, as you know, respects our free will and autonomy. He wants to speak to us, but we have to ask to hear his voice. We have to invite his voice into our lives. So ask Jesus to hear his voice. Second, turn down the noise. You need some space and silence for Jesus. It's impossible to hear Jesus if you have all this noise going on in your life. And Jesus does not talk to us out loud, but he talks to us in our hearts. And the only way that we can hear him is by having the quiet time and those periods of silence. The third key to hearing Jesus' voice is to read the Gospels. The Gospels give us Jesus' words. They tell us what he said. Have no doubt, Jesus has specific words for you. He knows your name. He knows you personally, inside and out. But in order for you to hear what he has to say to you, you need to become familiar with the Gospels. You recognize the voice of a loved one because you know how they speak and the words they use, as well as their tone of voice. You will recognize Jesus' voice if you become familiar with the words he used and how he interacted with people in the Gospels. This week, I invite you to start reading through one of the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Just one of them. Pay attention to how Jesus addresses people. Imagine the tone of voice he used in speaking to people and addressing them. And then also during the week, I want you to pray Psalm 23. Pray it when you get up in the morning. Pray it again at noon. Pray it again before you fall asleep. Pray it for yourself, for each other, for America, and for the world. Pray it slowly and deeply. Allow some silence, a soaking space between each verse. And whether you pray the verses from memory or from the Bible or from a prayer book, pray them like this. The Lord is my shepherd. There is nothing I shall want. All shall be well. He makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside still waters. All shall be well. He restores my soul. He leads me down the right path for his name's sake. All shall be well. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff to comfort me. All shall be well. You spread a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. All shall be well. Surely your goodness and your kindness shall follow me all the days of your life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord for years to come. Every manner of thing shall be well. How fortunate we are that Psalm 23 is the psalm we can relate to with this gospel and with all that is going on in our lives and our world. It is exactly what we need to hear today and tomorrow and the next day and the day after that.